Chapter 10. The family begins to starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school. Standing by the window, he saw huge flakes drifting slowly down out of the icy sky that was the color of steel. By evening, it lay 4 feet deep around the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow, there came a freezing gale that blew for days and days without stopping, and oh, how bitter cold it was! Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice, and every time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came in through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The four old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave it a thought now to do anything except the two vital problems of trying to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about cold weather that gives everyone an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich steaming stews and hot apple pies and all kinds of delicious warming dishes. Because there was a great deal luckier than we realized, we usually get what we want or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because his family couldn't afford it. And the cold weather went on, and he became ravenously and desperately hungry. Both bars of candy, the birthday one and the one Grandpa Joe had bought and had since been nibbled away, and now all he got were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then, all at once, the meals became thinner. The reason for this was that the toothpaste factory, the place where Mr. Bucket worked, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck. In the end, the only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets. But it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that 7 people needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each of them, and lunch was maybe half of a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everybody in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would have to pass Mr. Wonka's chocolate factory. And every day as he came near it, he would lift his small pointed nose high in the air and sniff the wonderful sweet smells of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes, taking deep, swallowing breaths as though he were trying to eat the smell itself. That child, said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from the blanket one morning, that child has got to have more food. It doesn't matter to us. We're too old to bother with this, but he's a growing boy. How can he look like this? He's beginning to look like a skeleton. And that's Charlie outside the gates of Mr. Wonka's factory. What can one do? Murmured Grandma Josephine miserably. He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother tried to slip her own bread onto his plate at breakfast this morning, and he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back. He's a fine little fellow, said Grandpa George. He deserves better than this. The cruel weather went on, and every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face became frighteningly white and pinched. The skin was sewn drawn tightly over his cheeks so you could see the shapes of his bone underneath. It seemed doubtful whether he could go much longer without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with that curious wisdom that seems to come so often with small children and hardships, he began to make little changes here and there to save strength. In the morning he left the house 10 minutes earlier so he could walk slowly to school, without ever having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during recess, resting himself while the other children rushed outside and threw snowballs and wrestled in snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent being tired. Then, one afternoon, walking back home from the icy wind in his face, and feeling hungrier than he ever had before, his eye caught suddenly by a piece of paper that was lying in the gutter in the snow. The paper was a greenish color, and there was something vaguely familiar about it. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw it at once and he knew what it was. It was a $1 bill. Quickly he looked around him. Had somebody dropped it? No, that was impossible because of the way it was buried. Several people went hurrying past him in the sidewalk, their chins deep in their collars and their coats, and their feet crunching the snow. There's Charlie finding the dollar. None of them were searching for any money. None of them were taking the slight notice. Then it was his. This dollar? Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it from the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole $1. He held it tightly between his shivering hands, gazing down at it. This meant one thing and one thing only. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began pacing towards the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery store, the kind that sells everything, including candy and cigars. And what would he do? He whispered to himself. He would buy 1 bar of candy, eat it all up, every bit, and then take the rest of the money home and give it straight to his mother. Chapter 11. The Miracle. Charlie entered the store and laid the damp dollar bill on the counter. One Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mellow Delight, he said, remembering how much he loved the one he had for his birthday. The man behind the counter looked fat and well fed. He had big lips and large cheeks and a large neck. The fat around his neck bulged out at the top of his collar like a rubber ring. He turned and reached behind him for the candy bar, and then he turned back and handed it to Charlie. Charlie grabbed it and immediately tore off the wrapper and took an enormous bite. Then he took another and another. Oh, the joy of being able to cram large pieces of something sweet and solid into one's mouth. The sheer bliss of being able to fill one's mouth with the rich, solid food. You look like you want another one, son, the shopkeeper said pleasantly. Charlie nodded, his mouth bulging with chocolate. The shopkeeper put Charlie's change on the counter. Take it easy, he said. It'll give you a gut ache if you swallow it all in one without chewing. Charlie went on wolfing the candy. He couldn't stop. And in less than half a minute, the whole thing had disappeared down his throat. He was quite out of breath, but he felt marvelously, extraordinarily happy. He reached out his hand to take the change. Then he paused. His eyes were just at the level of the counter. They were staring at the little silver coins laying there. The coins were all dimes. There was 9 of them altogether. Surely it wouldn't matter if he just spent one more. I think, he said quietly, I think I'll have just one more of those candy bars, the same kind as before, please. Why not? The fat shopkeeper said, reaching behind him, grabbing another Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mellow Delight from the shelf. He laid it on the counter. Charlie picked it up and tore off the wrapper, and suddenly, from underneath the wrapper, there came a brilliant flash of gold. Charlie's heart stood still. It's a golden ticket! Screamed the shopkeeper, leaping up in the air. You've got the golden ticket! You found the last golden ticket! Hey, what do you know? Everybody come look! This kid's found Wonka's last golden ticket! There it is! It's right there! It's in his hands! It seemed as though the shopkeeper might be having a fit. In my shop, too! He found it right here in my little shop! Somebody call the newspapers quick! And let them know. Watch out now, Sonny. Don't unwrap it. That thing's precious. In a few seconds, there was a crowd of about 20 more people clustering around Charlie, and many more pushing their way in from the street. Everybody wanted to look at the golden ticket and the lucky finder. Where is it? Somebody shouted. Hold it up so we can see it. There it is. There it is. Someone shouted. He's holding it in his hands. See the gold shining? How did he manage to find it? I'd like to know, said a large boy. 20 bars a day you've been buying for weeks and weeks. Think of all the free stuff he's going to be getting, said another boy. A lifetime supply. He'll need it, the skinny little shrimp, said the girl, laughing. Charlie hadn't moved. He hadn't even wrapped the golden ticket from around the candy bar. He was standing very still, holding it tightly with both hands while the crowd pushed and shouted all around him. He felt quite dizzy. There was a peculiar floating sensation coming over him, as though he was floating up in the air like a balloon. His feet didn't seem to be touching the ground. At one point, he became aware of a hand resting on his shoulder. When he looked up, he saw a tall man standing over him. Listen, the man whispered. I'll buy it from you. I'll give you $50. How about that, eh? And I'll give you a new bicycle, okay? Are you crazy? Shouted the woman. I give you $500 for that ticket. You want to sell it, young man? That's quite enough, said the shopkeeper, pushing the way through the crowd. Leave the kid alone, will you? Make room, make room. And to Charlie, as he led everyone to the door, he said, don't let anybody have it. Take it straight home quickly before you lose it. Run all the way and don't stop till you get there. Charlie nodded. You know something, the shopkeeper said, pausing. I have a feeling you needed a break like this. It's awfully glad you got it. Good luck to you, Sonny. Thank you, Charlie said, and off he went, running through the snow as fast as his legs could go. As he flew past Willy Wonka's factory, he turned and yelled, I'll be seeing you soon! And 5 minutes later, he arrived at his own home.